Hey everybody, welcome back to Great Mondays Radio. Today we're gonna toss a little sauce. We're gonna give corporate America a little run for its money. We're gonna talk about how maybe businesses are not evolving in the way that they should. My guest today is Melissa Belongea. She is a recovering corporate creative strategist and sustainability anthropologist. And she has been, she's gone out on her own, but she spent a lot of time inside of organizations and has identified some things that she believes are broken and maybe the driver of what everybody's been calling, or at least last year we're calling quiet quitting. And she has sort of a different point of view on why people might be leaving. And then we're going to talk about how we can fix that, how what we might get into, what the future of business could look like. So thank you, Melissa, for coming on Great Mondays Radio.
Thank you so much, Josh. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit. So you are a creative strategist on your own. Tell me a little bit about what you're doing today, and then um where sort of where you came from. Give us a little bit of like context and background.
Sure. Today I'm a creative strategist and I'm starting to move into relationship coaching as well. And I'm combining both of those things to address what I see as just a need for more emotional skills development, and especially in the workplace and in the professional world where it just has felt like so many of the things that seem to bottleneck really revolve around relationship issues. So
Hmm.
that's my focus these days. And I have a marketing background, marketing and communication. And so I'm combining those two things as well in order to, help tell more rich, deep stories for clients and work with founders, individuals, and executive teams on resolving some of these sort of communication and relationship hurdles that seem to crop up pretty frequently.
So we'll get into that in a second. So you were before you went on your own, you were a content strategist, sort of a brand writer for a
Yep.
number of different companies. Can you take me through a quick tour of kind of what your corporate tour of duty was, where you worked, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
uh, so at least we know where these patterns are kind of coming from.
Yeah, definitely. So I was freelancing in-house for about 6 years at different companies, really well-recognized brands, Apple, Airbnb, Stitch Fix, um, and some other startups in there, and eventually moved into full-time roles at an innovation agency. And then my last full-time role was at Rivian. And sort of by the time I left there, I had kind of reached this place where I had seen a lot of similar patterns happening over and over, and I was just burnt out. So I, did the went back to freelance, but this time I was doing freelance out of house and starting to move in the direction of creating my own agency, and
Hmm.
really interested in this idea of consulting for companies around culture, because it just felt like it would, the patterns that were coming up just kept coming back to culture and relationships, things like that. So that's
And
kind of where I've been in the last year, figuring it out,
yeah,
piecing it together. But yeah,
that's how we got connected on a LinkedIn thread
yes.
around culture. And I think you have some very interesting ideas. So you and I are in agreement that things need to change inside of organizations. Let's talk about what are some of the challenges that you observe that your hypothesis is driving burnout and this quitting and turnover. Like there's a mismatch between talent engagement and corporate processes. What did you
Hmm.
see? What is your, and again, it doesn't have to do with any one particular company, but kind of an overall pattern that you're observing?
Mm.
What's not working?
Yeah. Well, I've sort of boiled it down to three core patterns that I feel like come across.
I like three. Three sounds right to me.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And they're really consistent. And so, you know, just I'll name them off the top. It's executive, alignment and vertical buy-in. So having executive leaders be aligned on the same strategy, because when they're not, their vertical teams end up not being aligned, and that causes a lot of friction. So that's one core pattern. Um, Another one is, just sort of these micro interactions around empathy and having that ability to, relate easier with people.
So
Um,
you're saying there's like a lack of understand the lack of empathy or the skill around empathy is causing friction between individuals and groups. Is that what you mean?
yeah, I think it's actually the speed of work is really hindering people's ability to be empathetic with one another and slow down
Ah,
enough
okay.
in
That
order
makes sense.
to.
Okay. So work is happening so quickly that essentially there's no time to be in a relationship with anybody, to talk to anybody.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And then I'm actually forgetting the third one.
It's all right. We notes are okay.
Okay. Yeah, let me dip in here really quick.
So we have an executive alignment. So you're observing a lack of executive alignment, which causes a lot of friction. You're observing that because of the pace of work, relationships are faltering. And I would add to that, there's this distributed work piece. So that's two.
Yes. And I actually closed my notes when I closed my tab. So I just want to bring this back up because I think it's important. Um, I'm actually, ah,
It's fine. I can go in and edit down the pause.
yeah, thank you so much.
No
Okay.
problem. No problem.
Okay. We're back on track. Um, so it's high levels of cultural hierarchy is the other one. And so I really think there's a distinction between functional hierarchy and cultural hierarchy. And that's kind of where a lot of the breakdown ends up happening, is when there's a lot of functional hierarchy and cultural hierarchy married, it creates these layers of bureaucracy. And I think that's what we're seeing in terms of companies wanting to flatten and take out sort of middle management in an attempt to kind of break down some of those inefficiencies.
What's cultural hierarchy? Define that for me. What do you mean?
Yeah. So I think cultural hierarchy has to do with an attitude more than a positioning in the company. So I think humans by nature, and again, I have an anthropology background as well. And so humans, anytime you put them in an arrangement where there's someone above and someone below, there's just almost a natural tendency to sort of posture in a way. And I've seen this even in people who are really, you know, kind and empathetic and have all the great qualities that we look for in good employees, but there's just something about the arrangement of hierarchy that sort of naturally, um, you know, puts people in a position of relating kind of above or below.
Mm,
Whereas and I think, again, it's really important in corporations to have a level of functional hierarchy and decision making because um, decision by consensus is trickier in an organization. I would say decision, peer-to-peer leadership and decision by consensus in an economy is different. But since we're focused on organizations for this moment, I do think making that distinction between functional hierarchy, like people having the ability to make the final call, and breaking down the cultural hierarchy where it's like I'm a senior leader and I'm willing for younger or, less senior people to challenge my ideas. I think that's a really important aspect and something that gets overlooked.
I see. Okay. So it's governance. Aren't they correlated? This sort of like the sort of technical role and the cultural role. I mean, isn't that like, isn't that strongly correlated in your mind? I mean, that's why they converge, right?
I think they're correlated because people haven't taken the time to separate them out. Uh,
Ah,
so just
okay.
by default, they're correlated, but I actually don't think they're
They
necessary.
should be. You don't think
I
that
don't
they
think they should
should
be, and I
be.
don't think they need to be.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay. So that to me is revelatory, right? So there's a default position when you are running an organization, you are a manager or a director and you're running an organization. The cultural assumption is deference.
Yeah.
And what we want or what we see, what you're arguing for here is, hey, if you understood me as, let's go back to the empathy piece. If you understood me as a human, you understand that it's okay if you want to bring up some ideas, some of your own ideas. This isn't the military per se, right?
Right.
This isn't those two things. The assumption is that they are correlated, but they shouldn't be. That's
Right.
really interesting. That's an interesting component of this.
Well, because what it does is it says, because I'm higher up on this hierarchy, I know more and I have better understanding when we know that that's not the reality. People, if we think of people, everyone has blind spots and everyone has a sort of like, you know, I just think everyone has a gift that they can contribute. And so whether you're an intern and you're coming into a brand new company, you have perspective that people that have been there for years and years don't have. And that's worth mining. And in the hierarchical structure, a lot of times that gets stamped out. Um, because of some of the inertia that occurs in these environments where it's like don't the enthusiasm gets a little stamped out, and if it's not, sometimes it gets you know and on the reverse, if the culture is too oriented toward enthusiasm and youth, then experience and wisdom and all of that gets stamped out on the other end. So I think that this idea of collapsing cultural hierarchy is really important because it kind of puts everybody on the playing field of like, we're all humans, we all have blind spots, we all have a perspective to contribute. And what we're actually trying to create in this organization is a master brain, like a central form of intelligence.
So let me add my own layer of my own thesis on that,
Sure.
connecting two of the pieces. And I feel like every time we talk, you make me think of you help me think of some new connections. I really appreciate that about our conversations. I'm not sure how to replicate that with other people, but I love it. Maybe I can. The there's a trade-off. So we're at a point where speed, getting companies feel organization leaders feel there's too much to do. There's too many things to do, and that's being driven by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, VUCA.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to do more stuff, and we only have the same amount of time. So that equates to speed. And so when you are forcing speed, then what you're talking about is prioritizing efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
And I already mentioned this, right? So the military is meant to be an efficient machine where the decision is made from the top down, and that was the original way that businesses were modeled after machines. That's what we were supposed to do.
Hmm.
And so what you're reflecting, what you're describing is the result, the natural endpoint, the natural result of a drive for efficiency, which is, I don't want you to add any information to the system. I've made a decision.
Hmm.
And in my mind, there is a direct tension between efficiency and, on the other end, you might have, I don't know, you might call it innovation or creativity or
Hmm.
new ideas, generative ideas, or amplification of ideas.
Yeah.
And so then, bringing it back to you, this this experience, is what I'm describing the experience that drove your um, disillusionment with how organizations are run? Is what I'm describing what you've experienced? Is that the driver of that burnout? Is that why you are here? And if like, what have I gotten right? What have I gotten wrong?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good summary. I mean, I think different contexts warrant different structures, right? It sounds like the military needs that level of structure. I don't know. I haven't been exposed to that environment, but that's a different level of stakes than what we're talking about at the corporate level, where your business is largely based around people. And if we're not understanding people at a core level, then somewhere we're missing the mark. And so what really has driven me away from those environments is that I just I kept finding that I wasn't, you know, there was only a certain amount of the day that I was actually producing good work and actually seeing that work shipped. And that is, as a creative, honestly, this is a lot of where the motivation for this type of consulting has come from, is because as a creative, I want to be producing good work and seeing it out in the world. And I, want to see my teammates and peers feel like we're being productive together. And just the way that I found the hierarchy system to be set up is it kind of does the opposite of all of those things. And so the one exception I will say is that I worked at an innovation agency, which I think I mentioned at the beginning. And it was just, that was actually very different. And so they still had a level of functional hierarchy, but they were successful in collapsing this cultural hierarchy. And the other thing is that they hired on the metric of empathy. So
Mm.
I think they did a really concentrated, good, exceptional job of hiring people who had a sense of empathy when they came through the doors. And so those two things combined created the conditions for this culture to take shape, where it was fast moving. I mean, we were moving very quickly, working for clients. But there was just, I think what was different about that is everyone had a sense of sharing and collaboration, that we could build on each other's ideas. So people didn't get too precious about, you know, their idea being maybe drawn over with somebody else's, because what we were trying to do is solve the problem in the room. And that was just a different orientation than I had experienced before. And it created a different effect in terms of the culture of that
Mm.
agency. And it actually created efficiency because we were able to move so quickly. And there was a level of organization there. There was a level of like, it wasn't process necessarily, it was regular check-in points that were served as these sort of anchors in which we could come back together and create alignment. So it was like, go off, do your own thing, come back together, create alignment. Go off, do your own thing, come back together, create alignment. It just created this cadence of like, people being able to produce their craft and align with the goals of the brief or the goals of the client. And so I thought that was pretty eye-opening and paradigm shifting for me in terms of
Mm.
seeing how these two things can coexist. I think, there were parts of that system that I wanted to improve as well, and it wasn't perfect, but it was really, really good. And the leadership was pretty exceptional in terms of shepherding that environment.
So great. So I love that you're challenging the construct that I said, the efficiency and creativity or intention. So what you're describing now is this shift where a level of trust has been established because the rules of the road, the rules of the room have been
Hmm.
established. You
Yes.
don't have to waste your time on or energy, psychic energy or physical energy on trying to like, oh, am I going to step on someone's toes? This is their
Exactly.
project.
Yeah.
And so you're able to establish some rules that say, hey, we do this here and this is the way it works. And that's what I've observed, is that not enough organizations, and I'll say organizations sort of large, medium, and small, even on teams of 12, 6, 12 people, where it's they don't taken the time to create a set of agreements, let's call them, around,
Yeah.
and if they have, maybe they haven't addressed them, and they're sort of, this is, to me, this is, I think, one of the cruxes of the kind of new organization, where it's like, hey, it's not just this is what we do, this is how we do it, this is how we work together. And so really the culture is established explicitly, and we're doing it in a way that says, hey, this isn't about politics, this isn't about idea ownership, this is what we expect to happen here. And
Yep.
that's what you experienced. And it sounds like it was modeled from the top down.
Yes. Yeah, it definitely was. And it was, again, it's about the idea. It's about, and so when that becomes the central focus instead of, sort of overly, overly focusing on people's performance, which was important. And, people do have to deliver at a certain level. And I think there's a separate conversation that goes along with that in terms of people nurturing. But, it was more about how do we how do we all work together. And I think part of that, and this is the part that I think was, could have used some improvement, and this is just generally what I've experienced in all of these environments, is okay, so even with the rules of the road being open and more collaborative and kind of like, I can draw outside of the lines and hopefully you won't get offended, people still, people's toes still got stepped on. And when that happens, it's like, okay, can we have a productive conversation about this so we can get back on track, And
Yeah.
and I actually feel like I had several of those conversations and they went okay. But I think the layer I was looking for more, and I found this, you know, in other environments as well, is can we actually have a mechanism for problem solving at the sort of relationship or emotional skill level? Can we teach people how to just squash conflict in the moment versus having to have a review about it or something like that? Like, can
Yeah,
we?
more
Yeah,
efficient for sure. And that's
yeah,
something I think Americans in particular aren't awesome at conflict. And so I think we do all
yeah.
need to skill for that. So let's then take this. So we're starting to offer some solutions to some of these issues that you've seen. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about how you're taking observations about the way that nature works to apply it to how businesses should work. And I think that's really where this starts to get really interesting and juicy. You have a project called Regenerate by Design, and
Mhm.
this concept of regenerative design, and it's not so much let's save the planet, although that's part of it. It's more, how do we use the principle, well, you define it, something about the principles of nature to inform how we operate. Is that correct?
Yeah. And so when I think about nature as a designer, nature's been iterating and designing for billions of years and has really efficient processes kind of locked down. And so it does actually have to do with the planet, because we're at this inflection point where, climate change is becoming something that we're having to work with in terms of creating resilience, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Gen Z is very passionate about the environment. And I think a lot of these issues that we've outlined in the first part of this conversation actually really stem from a disconnection with the more emotional or feeling parts of our world, which I would include nature in that. Like we are humans in general in this modern culture are very disconnected from nature. And so bringing that back into the conversation and recognizing that we are part of nature and our relationship with nature really matters is one, that's kind of the background. But when I think about, regeneration is it's kind of the next evolution of sustainability. And sustainability in my mind is really synonymous with kind of sustaining the status quo. And so if regeneration is the next evolution of that, it's really about how do we create these self-sustaining, self-nurturing cultures and
Mm-hmm.
systems that, kind of fold back into themselves and continuously re-nourish the material that they're working with. And so an example of that is, when we think about regeneration in agriculture, which is mostly where that word is associated, it's all about the soil. It's all about soil health. And if we translate that to a people environment, I would consider culture to be the soil. So
Hmm.
in a food system, if you don't have healthy soil, you don't get healthy food. You have, degradation of the environment when the soil erodes, things like that. So if we translate that into the company environment, it's like if we don't keep the soil healthy, aka the culture, we can't have thriving outputs, and that includes people. Uh, so again, the opposite of that is if we're not paying attention to culture, the soil is eroding, and we're not going to be able to replenish after a certain point. So that's the best way I can relate it to, from a nature metaphor
Mm-hmm.
into the corporate environment. But
Yeah.
actually another,
Go
yeah,
ahead. Yeah, yeah. I want to hear. Yeah,
yeah.
I want to hear.
So
I
just
want to hear more
another,
for sure.
yeah, another quick metaphor is thinking about, so I have a partner that I work with in the Regenerate by Design project, George Polius, and he was a VP at Apple for a while, and worked at some startups. But a lot of he was really successful in his roles because he actually just boiled his strategies down to people and curiosity and empathy. And that's really what is at the heart of his success. And so the two of us together are, we're both really focused on the people experience in creating company culture, obviously. And so a metaphor that we use in terms of trying to be surgical about this, because I think part of the reason that leaders are hung up on not really understanding why culture is so important is it feels amorphous, it feels abstract, and it's like, what do you mean when you're talking about culture?
Yeah.
And so, another thing we try to do is look for the dams. So in an ecosystem, dams, these are man-made structures that have wreaked a lot of havoc on the environment in terms of um, you know, damage and whatnot. And so if we think about let's remove the dams, let's break down the dams where it's creating these problems, then it starts to clear the waterways.
Hmm.
So if we think about that in a company culture scenario, it's like let's identify and locate the dams that are kind of wreaking the most havoc on culture and dismantle them and let then hopefully that will help the waterways flow cleaner, healthier, that kind of thing. So
Hmm.
it's really about that to me is efficiency in terms of, let's not try to boil the ocean. Let's find the places where it's just the most blocked and clear that energy, clear that waterway. And you'll see a lot of change just from those really pointed efforts.
Do you have? I like this. I like this metaphor because it's. I mean, the best metaphors are useful in revealing something that we hadn't thought about. And so there's these dams are kind of what you're maybe thinking, or what other people call like high leverage points or something like that.
Mhm.
And so, but what is added to that to me is that the kind of it is a man-made block that
Hmm.
can be removed, and there's sort of a natural energy that will kind of retake the kind of process. Are there any examples of dams that you've observed or been part of removing?
Um, I think the examples I go back to are times when I've been on a team because I've tried to solve this problem at the team level.
Yeah.
And ultimately, what I've kind of realized is that it has to come from the very top. It has to come from the CEO and the executive leadership team in order for this kind of work to funnel down into
Mm,
the rest of the organization. But when I
okay.
was trying to solve it at the team level, it looked like cross-functional alignment. So I would be in a meeting and there was clearly a disagreement between the two vertical heads and not really seeing each other's perspectives. And so what I was able to do in a meeting like that is find the third way. So find the way that blends both of these perspectives. And then it was like, okay, that, let's go off and explore that as an option. And it seemed to have reset the culture in the room at the time. And I think it's just that, honestly, it's that demonstration of finding the third way. I don't think humans, or at least our culture, is not used to the third way right now. It's kind of black or white.
That's
And
right.
so it's that skill. It's polishing the skill of both
Mm-hmm.
um and looking for what are the pieces of your idea that work, what are the pieces of your idea that work, and how do we bring them together into the way that could be the way that actually works, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And also the other thing I'll say about that is I remember specifically it was like the the tone of the, you know, sort of, I don't want to say it was an argument because it wasn't, but just the tone of the disagreement was like, where are the marketing choices? Where are the creative choices? And I think when you're working on this was a website, and it's like, when you're working on a website, you can't cut it down, the middle like that. It's a blend of
Yeah.
both of those choices. And so it's like, so I think it's, again, that to me is like a siloed way of that, to me is a total result of hierarchy. When you're thinking in terms of like, what's a marketing decision, what's a product decision, what's a creative decision, what's a sales decision,
Yeah.
that's, to me, that signifies a high level of hierarchy. Whereas if you move over into, okay, what is the sales perspective? What is the marketing perspective? What is the creative perspective? What is the product perspective? And how do we turn that into a master
So
result?
a solution, right? So as opposed to this is what I have the responsibility to do in order to,
Exactly.
it's it's defending a particular territory versus how do we rethink about like, oh, my perspective, let me lend my expertise to this.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I love the third way is that's a great way to think about it. And if ultimately, to me, it sounds like the way that you use the third way in this situation was because you didn't have the capacity or the power or the ability to solve it at the highest level, right? Of which is ultimately where we started this conversation, which is business is broken, right? So we've created these verticals in order to create efficiencies, in order to deconstruct and tackle parts of the problem, but they're incentivized in the wrong ways, for
Yes.
example. And so they're going to be at cross purposes. And so here we're back at this. Oh, so that's one of the big parallels, one of the big patterns that you've observed. So to me, what I'm hearing is that this idea of redesigning business needs
Mhm.
to be taken at every level because
Mhm.
most people aren't at the highest level to be able to say, hey, we need to no, and even if they are, they may not have the vision or the ability to change everything about a business. And so we need to change it where we can change. And so by using this ability to just kind of zoom out and say, hey, we're thinking about right now, we're thinking about this in a hierarchical sense, the cultural hierarchy or the technical hierarchy, when in
Mhm.
fact, what we need to do is actually refocus on what the solution is and offer this kind of move from competitive to collaborative work, which is
Yes.
what nature does all the
Yes.
time, right?
Exactly. Yes. Symbiosis. There's different kinds of symbiosis, but ultimately and this is actually the whole point of my work, is interdependence. So it's
Mm,
finding that spot between being an individual in a community setting, because I've been in, I've also been in meetings that they're too collaborative and nothing happens and no decisions get made, and it's just too much of that. And I would put that on, I'd consider that somewhat codependent. And so it's like, if I move this way, you move this way, and it's like you're not getting that creative tension that creates the great ideas.
yeah,
And it's too saturated. So it's coming to the middle, again, the third way around how do I be an individual in a connected space,
right.
and that's a skill. So I just boil it down to the micro is the macro. If we could teach people at the micro level how to be in interdependence with one another, it would actually, spiral out to the macro result of this more solution oriented culture versus
Hmm.
either being overly independent or overly, I don't want to say overly communal, because I think community is really, really important, but, just finding that middle ground. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so dependent on one, independent on one side, codependent on the other. We need to find that interdependency and establish the rules. What are the agreements about how we do interdependence in our team, on our group,
Yes.
and what can we learn from, observations about how organisms have worked in this way, so our
Yeah.
organization can actually work more efficiently.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing I'll say about this model of, because it is moving toward peer-to-peer leadership. So the other issue I really have noticed in terms of the leadership level, not executive leaders, but like director level, they're stressed to the max. They don't have time to mentor, plus do all the things
Yep.
that their job requires. So
Yep.
I think creating these collaborative pods, or however you want to set up the culture, that creates this peer-to-peer mentorship, um, ability, where now people are getting mentored by their peers. So just by being part of this organism, you're learning, you're growing, and that's one of the things that keeps people engaged. Like if people aren't, if they're not advancing in their career, they're not advancing in their, skill set at a job, that gets stagnant really quick. But if you're surrounded by other peers that are teaching you something and you're teaching them something, and there's an openness around this teaching environment, that takes a lot of pressure off of the sort of like middle management layer to
Yeah.
always have to show up for their people. Because I I think it's a great and noble quest, but I've seen the reality of directors trying to please everybody in that way, and it's kind of unrealistic,
Mm.
in terms of what they're being asked to do. And so uh yeah, and I think that that's happening a lot more, where people are looking for the player coach leaders, and that's great. But I think what the coaching needs to be about is setting up a coaching environment, not necessarily coaching every person so individually, because the time is not allowed for that.
Mhm.
So
Very cool. Well, this has given me a lot to think about. Hopefully folks that are listening are taking notes and absorbing some ideas. I think there's a lot more to learn from nature and a lot more ideas. So we'll continue to follow kind of your thought leadership in that way. If you want to follow along follow Melissa Belange's work, you can head over to her website, regeneratebydesign.com, and melissabelonge.com, melissabelongea.com. Melissa, thank you for sharing some of that wisdom that and those observations with Great Mondays Radio. It was really nice to talk to you.
yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate your work, and thank you so much.